Hello, I'm Colleen, and these are my 11 favorite classics of all time. I'm just going to jump right in and get this started. So let's begin with my favorite classic of all time, which is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Now, this is a beautifully written book following the life of a young woman named Jane living in Florida in the early 1900s in America. There are really important themes about the Jim Crow laws going on in this book, but also her relationships with different men throughout her life, specifically Tea Cake. If you've ever heard of that name, you probably know that the love story they share is beautiful, though tragic. This book has one of the most beautiful beginnings I've ever read, so I am going to read you the first paragraph to try to entice you to read it yourself. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. It's such a beautiful paragraph. This is a really beautiful book. It did make me cry because the ending is sad, but I would very much recommend it. Also, if you're feeling cold and you need a warm up, this book just transports you to Florida. So you do feel very warm and the atmosphere is wonderful and it's just a really lovely read. I did not read this in any of my classes. I read this for fun in my 20s and it was a great choice. The next book that kind of vies for my favorite classic of all time is The End of the Affair by Greene. I did read this for school, and when I read it, I just was overcome with how beautiful the story is. Our narrator is Maurice, and he is living in this horrific sort of cycle of hate and anger at this woman, Sarah, who he had been having an affair with, but she broke it off with him. The setting is World War II in England, and you follow Maurice's grief over losing Sarah and how he has to watch her be with her husband in front of him. And it's such a heart-wrenching tale, but when you read the end of the book, it's so beautiful and it makes so much sense. This has a lot to do with not religion, but more like belief and what our faith is and how people look at faith. Maurice is an atheist, and Sarah was an atheist until recently, and he doesn't really understand why she has flipped to now being a relatively devout Catholic. I really recommend this book. It's also very short, so if you want to just read a quick one, it's under 200 pages. This is a great read. The next classic I absolutely adore is The Stranger by Albert Camus. This was a book that was very important to me because it's the first time I ever read anything existential, and I actually read it in English, and then I also read it in French for my French class. I would not be able to read it in French right now if I tried to, but I could once upon a time. It's such a cool story, and the idea of existentialism and that nothing matters comes across really well in this book. I've also read Waiting for Godot and No Exit. I've read all of those, but this is definitely my favorite existential. You get the dread, you get the crisis, you get the what does it all mean feeling, and it's a great read. Next, I threw in a mystery for fun, and that is And Then There Were None. It is a mystery I've read more than once, which is kind of strange because usually once you know what happens, mysteries kind of lose their appeal. It's my first Agatha Christie I ever read, and I remember thinking as I read this for the first time when I was 14 years old that this woman was brilliant and that she had such a cool mind, and the way that she works this mystery, if you're unfamiliar, I'm not going to give this away if you haven't read it because you should, is so fascinating how she puts this puzzle together at the end. It's a really good read. If you're not familiar with the plot, it's about 10 people who get sent invited to this island, and then once they're there, they're stuck, and they find out that each one of them is sort of responsible for the death of another human being, and then one by one they all start to die. It's fabulous fun read. My next classic on my top 11 list is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which I do not have because I had a hard copy that I was reading in high school, and I was reading in the car, and we were driving home from a really long drive to see my mom's family, and which is 6 hours in the car, and my sister threw up all over it. So I threw away that copy, and then I got an ebook copy for my Kindle recently, and so I don't actually have a physical copy. And when I went to the library yesterday, all the physical copies were checked out because it's lovely. I really love Jane Austen, and Pride and Prejudice is my favorite Jane Austen. I'm only about 50% of the way through with Northanger Abbey, but I believe Pride and Prejudice is still my favorite. I love the Bennet sisters. I love Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. I love Mr. Darcy. I love Mr. Bingley. I love Carolyn Bingley. I love Wickham. I love everything about that story. The first time I was exposed with Pride and Prejudice was that my mom was obsessed with the 5-hour BBC version with Colin Firth, which for me is the one true Pride and Prejudice. And so I watched it constantly, and then read the book for the first time, I think when I was 16, and then read it again. Not that long ago. I think I read it maybe in 2018. And I just love it. It's funny and romantic, and I really love the relationships between the sisters. It's just a really great read. The next book on my list is completely changing gears from Pride and Prejudice, and that is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. I read this for fun when I was in college. So I had heard about this book a bunch, and I really wanted to read it. And this was a book that when I read it, I thought to myself, how cool to have been the first person who wrote a book like this. I also really liked that this book had a lot of pit stops in small towns in the Midwest that I had been to and heard of. And at that time I was going to college on the East Coast and feeling very disassociated from my Midwest upbringing. If you're not familiar with the book, Jack Kerouac basically got really high and laid on a bathroom floor and wrote it, I think, in 48 straight hours. And I don't know how edited it is, but it's a really good read. One of my cousins moved from the Midwest to Seattle and drove alone, and he listened to this while he was driving. He said it was the perfect thing to listen to while you're making that drive. So it's basically about this group of friends who just drives all over the United States constantly, and they're all a little bit high, and I really liked it. There's not a ton of plot. It's just really written, but still very enjoyable. The next book on my best of classics is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Now, this book is interesting because I haven't read it. I've read it twice, but I haven't read it since I was probably 14 or 15 years old, because my teacher taught it to us in 8th grade, but then we did it again freshman year of high school. And I remember thinking that this was such a important book when I read it. If you're not American, it's probably not as, it doesn't sit with you as much as it does if you are from America, because it really is a snapshot of a time period. You have this town, and you've got Scout, who's our narrator, and she's a child, and she's looking at sort of the injustices of her town. The story is framed by her father, Atticus, who's very, a famous character in literature, who is a lawyer and is defending a black man who's wrongly accused of the rape and attack of a white woman. There's also plot lines about a shut-in who doesn't come out, that people kind of think is a ghost. It's a great look at a snapshot of history. I really love the writing. I think Harper Lee is such an interesting author also because this is basically her only book. She did write Go Set the Watchman, I think it's called, which came out a couple years ago, and I did not read because I thought it was super shady how publishers basically waited until she had none of her intellectualism left to strong arm her to release that book. And then people didn't really like it because obviously she had really changed the character of Atticus. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. Back to this. I also really like this book because I think it does a really good job at having a child narrator but still feels like an adult book. I think it's part of the reason I enjoyed it so much when I was younger, because I did feel like I was reading a grown-up book. The next book on my list, the library didn't have, and I think I've mentioned in videos before that I don't have any of my books from college, but it's Beloved by Toni Morrison. This was not the first Toni Morrison book I read. I read Jazz first, and I read, I think Paradise before this as well. But this one definitely stuck with me the hardest. Toni Morrison has a really beautiful way of writing that almost feels like reading poetry. So when you're reading it, you really get swept off in her language and her ability to sort of weave these wonderful sentences together. Beloved is a book that I read for my American slave narrative class, which was something I took in college. And we have our main character, Setha, I think is how you pronounce it. And she is an escaped slave living in Ohio, but she really doesn't feel free. There's also the character of a ghost baby who's beloved, a child she had lost but never named, and just has a grave marker that says beloved. There's a really poignant and moving portion of this book that is about the Middle Passage, so the crossover for slaves from Africa to the Americas and all of the horrific acts that took place on those boats and all of the horrible injustices that this entire group of people were forced to endure, be it the Middle Passage, be it slavery, be it the time after slavery in which Sethe is really still not feeling free or like she can ever live the life that she wanted to. If you haven't read any Toni Morrison books, I would really recommend Beloved. Some of her other books are a little bit more difficult in terms of understanding. Like I'd say Song of Solomon is a little bit of like a harder read, but Beloved is beautiful and it's a very important story. So definitely give it a try. If you haven't tried Toni Morrison yet, you should. You're missing out. The next book on my top 11 books is one that I feel like very alone in loving, but that's okay because I love Beowulf. So I am very into like dark age history, where history kind of mixes with folklore and mythology. That's like my favorite stuff to read. Obviously, I love Arthurian legend. Beowulf has a very Arthurian legend feel to it. I read this 2 or 3 times. I read it for the first time in high school in my British literature class, and I remember being like, well, it seems that I really like stories about knights going out and murdering monsters, which I do. And I had a Jesuit priest teach that class, and he went so far into detail of the symbolism of like Beowulf is slaying Grendel, but it's really like Christianity slaying the pagans, and I really like that story a lot. I love the ending, which I feel like a book that was written in 800 AD. Can I not give away the ending? I probably shouldn't. Not 800 AD. About 1010, but the story is set centuries earlier, about when the Angles and the Saxons came to Britain, which is like one of my favorite parts of history, like the migration of different like tribes into England. It's hard for me to like recommend Beowulf because I feel like you either love it or you don't, and I do love it, but I know like a lot of people who hated it. So this is my controversial pick, Beowulf, author unknown. So for my last 2, I had to pick a poet, so it's more like a collection of works, and a play. So the poet I picked was Emily Dickinson. I absolutely adore her. Something about her poetry really makes me think of winter. I think that she's such an interesting person also because she basically lived like a recluse, but managed to write all this beautiful poetry. Her poems are short, lovely. Oh, that's kind of weird. I just opened to Wild Nights, which is one of her most famous poems. And Hope is a Thing with Feathers is also on here. Her poetry is so gorgeous. If you haven't ever taken the time to sort of peruse it, I'd recommend grabbing a collection from your library and just taking a cozy afternoon and getting to know Emily Dickinson. And my last pick is a Shakespeare play, which I've got my trusty collection of Shakespeare, and it's Midsummer Night's Dream. So Midsummer Night's Dream is my favorite Shakespeare play. It's a comedy. It is sort of a like fairies meddling in the love lives of mortals story. We have Oberon and Titania, who are the king and queen of the fairies. They get into a fight, and Oberon decides he's going to sort of like poison Titania, so she falls in love with a donkey, like an ass. And Robin Goodfellow / Puck is in it, and he helps it along. There's also this like love square of mortals. So we have Hermia, Helena, Lysander, and Demetrius, and I'm not going to remember exactly how it goes, but both men are in love with, I think, Hermia, and no one's in love with Helena, but Helena's in love with one guy and Hermia's in love with the other, and it would be more convenient if they worked it out, but instead the spell they use gets flipped and everyone's now in love with Helena instead of Hermia. It's fantastic. It's really fun. It's like Shakespeare comedic gold with everyone, you know, their emotions are running high, and there's just a lot of fairy fun going on in the woods. I supremely recommend Midsummer Night's Dream if you haven't already read it. And if you want a movie version, the one with Michelle Pfeiffer is very good. And that wraps up my best 11 classics of all time. I hope there's something on this list that you are interested in and might have a bit of fun picking up. I hope you are in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book.